Hello friends, and welcome back to my YouTube channel and to our Complete Harp Beginners series. In today's session we're going to be moving on to placing our fingers onto the strings. We have of course already looked at the parts of the harp, the tuning of the harp and naming the strings, your body positioning and your hand and arm positioning. And today we're going to be moving on to look at that placing. So if you've seen all those other videos and you feel great and ready to move on, let's get going. Now, before we place our fingers onto the strings, we are going to number our fingers. And if you've played instruments before, you might be used to numbering your fingers. And this really helps us make sure we're using the right fingers for the right notes to get nice shapes and nice flowing movements through our melodies and through our left hand patterns. So with our harping, we number our fingers. 1 for our thumbs. Our index fingers are number 2. Our middle fingers are number 3. Our ring fingers are our number 4. And our pinkies, in Scotland we call our little fingers our pinkies. Our pinkies we don't use on the harp, so we don't give them a number. No using those pinkies. So we've got 1, 2, 3 and 4. And that's how we number our fingers ready to go to the harp. And you might have seen fingering written into sheet music to help you use the correct fingerings for the melodies or for the left hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're ready to go with your fingers. Okay, so moving over to our harp now, let's just quickly check in with our body. Feet are flat on the floor. My knees slightly lower than my hips. I can feel both of my seat bones on my stool. I'm sitting up nice and tall with my core engaged, but not overextending. My shoulders are relaxed and down. I can pull my harp to me. I'm going to angle it slightly so I can see all the strings comfortably. I have a nice tip point and I'm bringing my hands out. Gentle 90-degree angle in the elbow. Arms away from the body, wrists straight. And we're ready to place our fingers on the strings. Now, we're going to be placing all 4 of our fingers on the strings. And it doesn't actually matter where you choose to place these. You can place them anywhere. We're not plucking the strings yet. We're just getting our fingers in a nice position. Now, when you play the harp, you actually place all of your shapes before you play. And this is something that can be quite tricky as a beginner, making sure that you do place your fingers on the strings. You don't just pluck. Now, let me just explain exactly what that means and we'll take a closer look. You might have a tendency to want to, say if you were playing 4 fingers in a row, just play your fingers one after the other without placing your fingers. On the harp, to get a nice smooth sound, we place the whole shape, so all 4 fingers placed, and then we play the fingers. So it's important for us to get this placement really nice. Okay, so we're placing all 4 fingers on, doesn't matter where you place them, and everything that you do in the harp comes from and pulls to a fist. So we're going to go from a fist with our thumb on top. We're going to open our hand and gently place our fingers on. My fingers are pointing downwards on the strings and my thumb is up high. Now, when I say my fingers are pointing downwards, I don't mean completely downwards. If I pointed my fingers completely downwards, I would have to really overextend my fingers. They're gently pointing downwards on the strings and my thumb is high. Now, at this point, I think it's important to mention that everyone's hands are different. Everyone's hands are going to look slightly different on the strings, and that's okay. There's a few pointers that we should all watch out for, but my fingers are very short, and so when I place on my harp, my fingers actually look very straight. If you have longer fingers, then your fingers might look slightly more rounded. But the important thing is that we are placing the top of our finger pads onto the strings. So we want to make sure that we are getting a nice amount of our pad onto the strings to give us a nice sound. We don't want to place just the very, very tips of our fingers, because that will actually give us quite a tinny sound because of our nails, top of our finger pads. We also don't want to push our fingers too far through the strings. We don't want to be coming through the strings like this and then plucking from here. We want to just put the top of our fingers, the pads on, pointing downwards. And my thumb, you can see I'm really on the side of my thumb here. So my thumb isn't straight on like this. I'm on the side of my thumb and my thumb is up above my fingers. So things that you want to watch out for, like I said, if you have longer fingers, then your fingers might look slightly more rounded, and that's fine to get onto your finger tips. If, like me, you've got short fingers, they might look slightly more straight, and that's okay too. What we want to make sure we're not doing is that our palm is not parallel to the strings. So you can see if my palm is parallel to the strings, my fingers end up straight onto the strings. And when I pluck from this, I end up with like a kind of claw hand, which we don't really want. So we're gonna open our palm out. So our palm is pointing more downwards. My fingers can then lengthen slightly down the strings and they point more downwards. And I get this nice full space in my palm, which eventually I'll be plucking my fingers into. And my thumb is up nice and high. So again, we don't want a parallel palm like this. We want an open palm like this and our thumb high. This kind of position's fine, this kind of position's fine, rounded slightly fingers if you're longer. With regards to our thumb, you want to make sure your thumb is above your knuckles. So we can see if I draw a line from my thumb here, you can see clearly it's above my knuckles. If my thumb drops below my knuckles, we're not going to get as nice a sound. So if I draw a line from my thumb, you can see that it is now below my knuckles. So if I push my thumb up, push my fingers down, this is above the knuckles, this is above the knuckles. All of these different variations are above the knuckles. So depending on how your hand feels, depending on how much mobility you have in your hand, depending on how long your thumb is, how long your fingers are, you're going to have some variation in your hand shape. But you want to make sure that your thumb is above your knuckles. Okay, so we're going to practice coming from a closed fist, opening our fingers and gently just placing them onto the strings. And what we don't want to do is come at the strings straight on and then move our hand into that shape. So we don't want to be placing and then moving. We just want to open our hand nicely so our fingers are going onto the strings, just like this. Okay, and that is how you practice your placing, just gently opening onto the strings. I'm opening onto strings right next door to each other. You can then try different shapes. So we could try our fingers opening onto strings where there's always a one string gap. Let's have a closer look at that. So I'm just placing in a slightly different way. It's a bit more of a stretch, but you can still see that my thumb is higher than my knuckles. My palm is open, my fingers are down. I now have a one string gap between each of my fingers, so I can practice that placing. And again, I'm just gently opening my hand and my fingers just gently fall onto the strings. I'm not coming straight onto the strings and then shifting my hand into position. Just gently opening onto those strings. You can, of course, practice just placing 2 fingers if you like. You can practice placing 3 fingers, and like we just did, you can practice placing 4 fingers, and all of these shapes are worth practicing. Exactly the same idea in my left hand. I'm going to have my elbow at that nice gentle angle, my arm slightly away from my body. If my arm's in, you can see I get a bend in my wrist. My palm is open. Again, if I get parallel to the strings, can you see the bend happening? We don't want that bend. Open palm, fingers pointing down, thumb above the knuckles. We're just going to gently open and close. The hand shape is exactly the same when you're placing your fingers onto the strings here. No matter what hand, you're going to place in the same way. Those are strings that are next door neighbours. If you try missing a neighbour, one string between each finger, we're going to get the same thing. Let's just take a little closer look at that. Here I am placing next door neighbours. And then if we have a string between each, just like that. And you can practice that in both hands as well, of course. Doesn't matter where you're placing. In fact, I'd recommend placing all over your harp. Always just opening, fingers falling gently downwards onto the strings, thumb high. If you've got a gap between the strings as well, you can give the strings a little squish, just like that. And that is how to place your hands onto the strings. So I hope that video was helpful to you all, learning all about making sure we get our hands in that nice position, remembering to open that palm up so we create lots of space. Fingers are falling gently down, very relaxed. Thumb is higher than the knuckles. Everything's gonna eventually, when we start plucking, pull into a fist. So we're nice and relaxed, just like this. Fingers down, thumbs up. And if you find this position hard at first to master, don't worry. This hand position is not something that we naturally do in day-to-day life. If you think about typing on a keyboard, your hands are like this. If you take these hands and put them on a harp, that's not great harp hands. Or maybe you're texting on your phone, holding your phone like this, take your hand like this, put it on the harp. It's not a great harp hand. What about if we are eating dinner? Take these hands. So there's not a lot of things that we do in general day-to-day life that put our hands into this position. And so it can be a hard one to master. So take your time, practice opening your hands onto the strings, allowing yourself to find that position that's comfortable for you. And do, of course, let us know in the comments how you're getting on. Do you have more curved fingers? Do you have longer fingers? Are your thumbs longer? Do you have shorter fingers like me? How are your hands looking? In our next session, we're going to move on to plucking our strings. We're going to learn all about exactly how to pull those fingers in to produce a really beautiful sound, and also all about relaxing the hand. Because whenever we're playing, we want to make sure that we don't have tension. Yes, we're playing with strength and confidence, but no tension. Everything's nice and relaxed. And we're going to be looking at that in the next session together.